I still remember the exact shade of champagne gold my mother chose for my sister's wedding invitations. She spread the samples across the dining table like they were sacred objects. My father stood beside her with a glass of wine in one hand and a calculator in the other, pretending this was all practical. My sister, Vanessa, sat in the middle of it all like a queen being fitted for a crown. And me? I was standing 3 feet away, holding my own engagement ring in my pocket, waiting for a moment that never came. That night was the first time I understood something I should have known years earlier. In my family, love was never divided equally. It was invested, and my parents had already decided which daughter was worth the full amount. If this story resonates with you, subscribe to Revenge Story Vault, and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I always read the comments. My name is Elara. I was 28 when I got engaged. At the time, I was working 60-hour weeks as a project coordinator for a medical software company in Columbus, Ohio. I lived in a 1-bedroom apartment with beige walls, secondhand furniture, and exactly enough peace to hear myself think. It was not a glamorous life, but it was mine, and I had built it without help. My fiancé, Daniel, proposed on a cold Sunday afternoon in February. No orchestra, no photographer hiding in the bushes, no expensive rooftop dinner, just a quiet walk by the river, numb fingers, red cheeks, and a man who looked me in the eyes like I was the only person in the world. When I said yes, I thought the hardest part was over. I thought I had found my person. I thought building a wedding would be stressful, sure, but joyful. What I forgot was this. A wedding does not just reveal a couple. It reveals a family. And mine was about to expose itself in the ugliest way possible. Vanessa had gotten engaged 6 months before I did. That alone would have been fine. The problem was that my parents treated her engagement like a royal event, and mine like a scheduling inconvenience. For Vanessa, there was a venue tour, a champagne brunch, a private tasting menu, and long emotional speeches from my mother about making her dream day perfect. For me, there was one distracted hug from my father and my mother saying, "Well, at least now you won't have to wait too long." That sentence stayed with me. At least. As if my marriage was a practical errand, as if my life had finally caught up to my sister's script. A week later, my mother called and asked me to come over. Her voice was bright, performative, almost musical, the kind she used when guests were around or when she wanted something. When I got there, the dining room looked like a bridal showroom. Fabric swatches, centerpiece sketches, candles, 3 bakery boxes. Vanessa was flipping through floral designs while my mother held up 2 invitation samples under the chandelier light. "Oh good," she said when she saw me. "Help us choose. We're between ivory pearl and champagne linen." I stood there for a second, confused. Then I laughed a little and said, "You guys are moving fast." "We have to," Vanessa said. "Good venues get booked early." My father nodded as if this were a board meeting. "We're covering the wedding, so we want to make sure every dollar counts. Every dollar." He said it so casually, like he had not just changed the temperature of the room by 10 degrees. I looked at him, then at my mother, then back at the table. Nobody seemed uncomfortable. Nobody rushed to soften the sentence. Nobody said, "Of course we'll help you too," because in their minds, the hierarchy was already understood. I asked the question anyway. I should not have had to. But daughters like me learn early that if you want the truth, you have to drag it into the light yourself. "So," I said, keeping my voice steady, "are you planning to help with mine too?" My mother gave me that smile, the one that never reached her eyes, the one that said she had already judged my reaction before I had even had one. "Elara," she said gently, "we assumed you and Daniel would do something smaller, intimate, maybe just elope. Elope." She said it like it was elegant, like it was empowering, like it had not just translated in real time into, "Your sister gets the celebration. You get the exit door." I stared at her. My father cleared his throat and added, "It just makes more sense. Vanessa has always dreamed of a big wedding. You're more practical." Practical. That was the family word for less deserving. Vanessa did not even look embarrassed. She leaned back in her chair, crossed one leg over the other, and said, "Honestly, it fits you better. You've never really been the wedding type." That part almost made me laugh. Not because it was funny, because it was efficient. In one sentence, she erased every dress I had quietly bookmarked, every venue photo I had saved, every little private hope I had been too careful to say out loud. I wish I could tell you I delivered some brilliant speech. that I flipped the table, that I exposed 20 years of favoritism in one perfect monologue. I did not. I stood there in that warm dining room with the smell of vanilla frosting and eucalyptus samples in the air, and I felt myself becoming very, very still. That is what people misunderstand about humiliation. Sometimes it does not make you loud. Sometimes it makes you precise. I asked one question, just one. So you're paying for hers, I said. But for me, your advice is to disappear quietly? My mother sighed. Not with guilt. With irritation. Why are you making this ugly? There it was. The family reflex. They wound you. You bleed, then they blame the blood on you. I left 10 minutes later with a numb face and a locked jaw. In the car, I sat with my hands on the steering wheel and did not start the engine for almost 15 minutes. Outside, the porch light glowed behind their curtains. Inside, I could still see shadows moving around the dining room table, planning, laughing, continuing. That hurt almost more than the conversation itself. How easily life resumed once I was out of the room. Daniel found me in that parking space, still staring ahead, still silent. I had texted him only 3 words. Can you come? He knocked on the window gently. I unlocked the door. The second he sat down, I broke. Not dramatically, not all at once, just one sentence at a time. They're paying for hers. Pausa. They told me to elope. Pausa. I don't think they even heard themselves. Daniel listened without interrupting. That was one of the first reasons I knew he was different from my family. He did not rush to explain my pain back to me. He just made room for it. When I finished, he rested his hand over mine and said, "Then we build something they don't get to touch." At the time, I thought he meant the wedding. I did not realize he meant our whole life. For the next year, Vanessa's wedding became the central event around which the family calendar revolved. There were dress fittings, cake tastings, engagement photos, registry updates, seating chart emergencies, and a level of financial generosity I had never seen my parents extend to anyone else. Certainly not to me. They paid for the venue. They paid for the dress. They paid for the photographer. They paid for the live band. At one point, my father even joked that he should just hand over his retirement account and call it a day. Everyone laughed. I remember because I was standing there holding a tray of champagne flutes my mother had asked me to wash before guests arrived. That is the thing about scapegoat daughters. Even when they are invited, they are often invited as labor. Daniel and I did not elope, but we did go small. Not because my parents were right, because I refused to let their cruelty define the emotional architecture of my marriage. We got married in a botanical garden 2 towns over on a clear October afternoon. 32 guests. Simple white flowers, string lights, a pianist with soft hands and an old soul. My dress was not designer. My shoes hurt by the second hour. The cake leaned slightly to the left. It was perfect. Not because it looked expensive, because every single thing present had been chosen with love. No performance, no ranking, no one being rewarded, no one being quietly punished. My parents came, late. My mother complained about the parking. My father asked whether there would be an open bar. Vanessa showed up in a dress so pale it could almost have passed for white if the light hit it the wrong way. She hugged me and whispered, "Cute. Very you." And for the first time in my life, I heard what that really meant. Small, containable. Below her, I smiled and said, "Exactly. That marriage lasted. That matters." Because the years that followed did not produce some overnight transformation. No sudden fortune. No miracle inheritance. No cinematic revenge scene where everyone gasped and apologized before the credits rolled. What happened was slower, and much more satisfying. Daniel and I worked, quietly, relentlessly. He built a logistics consultancy from our spare bedroom. I moved from coordinator to operations lead, then into strategy, then into a director role after a merger doubled the size of my division. We bought a modest house, then another property as a rental, then another. We learned the language of long-term stability, budgets, equity, discipline, boundaries. Meanwhile, Vanessa's perfect wedding produced exactly the kind of marriage it had been designed to impress people into envying. Beautiful on the outside, expensive, fragile. By year 3, there were rumors. By year 4, there were debts. By year 5, there was a separation so bitter even my mother stopped calling it a rough patch. And suddenly, the family that had once acted like I was the practical daughter no one needed to invest in started using a different tone with me. My father called more often. My mother asked more questions. Vanessa, who had once treated me like background furniture with a pulse, started sending polite texts with too many exclamation points. That is another truth families do not like to admit. When your role changes, their memory changes too. Then, one rainy Thursday in March, my mother called and asked if she and my father could come by. She sounded subdued, careful, like someone approaching a locked gate. I knew something was coming. I just did not know how shameless it would be. They arrived at 6:30. My mother wore navy. My father carried a bottle of wine like a peace offering no one had requested. The rain tapped softly against the kitchen windows while Daniel made coffee and then disappeared upstairs, giving me the kind of silent support that never needed to announce itself. We sat at the table. My table. Solid oak. Paid for with money I had earned. In a house they had never helped me buy. My mother folded and unfolded her napkin. My father stared at the fruit bowl. Finally, she said it. Vanessa is engaged again. I almost laughed. Not because it was absurd, because somehow, I already knew this conversation was not about love. That's fast, I said. She deserves a fresh start, my mother replied. There it was again. Deserves. I nodded once, then waited. My father cleared his throat. Well, the truth is, things are a little tight right now. Of course they were. Vanessa's divorce had been expensive. My parents had helped with legal fees, temporary rent, credit card balances, a car payment, probably several things no one would ever fully admit out loud. My mother leaned forward. We were hoping, she said carefully, that maybe this time, since you and Daniel are doing so well, you could help. Not with groceries, not with medical bills, not with an emergency. With Vanessa's second wedding? For a second, the room went completely silent. Rain on glass, clock on wall, my own pulse in my ears. I looked at the woman who had once told me to elope because my sister's dreams mattered more. Then at the man who had called me practical when what he really meant was expendable. And in that moment, something settled inside me. Not anger. That had burned out years ago. Clarity. I asked, very calmly, how much? My mother named the number. It was more than Daniel and I had spent on our entire wedding. I repeated it back to her, just to make sure I had heard correctly. She nodded. Then I smiled. Not a cruel smile. Not even a triumphant one. Just the smile of someone finally standing in the exact truth of a situation. No, I said. My father's face changed first. Shock, then offense. How can you be so cold? Cold. I almost admired the efficiency. They humiliate me. Irasime. Ask me to finance the sequel. Then call me cold when I decline. My mother's eyes filled, but not with remorse. With wounded entitlement. We're family, she whispered. And I said the sentence I wish I had learned at 20 instead of 33. Family is not a lifetime subscription to my sacrifice. Neither of them spoke. So I continued. You paid for Vanessa's dream wedding. You told me to disappear quietly. You watched me build a life without your support. And now that I have something stable, you've returned to collect from it. That isn't love. That's access. And access is something I control now. My mother cried. My father stood up and paced. He accused me of punishing them. He said I was holding on to old bitterness. He said I was embarrassing them by refusing. And there it was. The word that mattered. Embarrassing. Not hurting them. Not abandoning them. Embarrassing them. Because somewhere in their minds, they had already pictured a story where the successful daughter stepped in, saved the day, and made the family look whole again. I was refusing the role. Publicly. Cleanly. Without raising my voice. That was the real offense. 3 months later, Daniel and I mailed invitations for our vow renewal. Not because our marriage needed repairing. Because we wanted to celebrate 5 hard-earned years together before trying for a baby. We booked a historic inn outside Asheville. Garden dinner. 40 guests. Leave strings. Real joy. No performance. I sent invitations to my parents. Not out of guilt. Out of precision. My mother called the day hers arrived. Her voice was trembling. Elara, she said. We didn't think we'd be invited. I looked at the cream envelope still sitting open on my counter and said, I almost didn't. She went quiet. Then came the question. Soft. Careful. Humiliating in a way only truth can be. Can your father and I still come? Not can we celebrate you. Not how can we make this right. Can we still come? 5 years earlier, they had decided I did not deserve a real wedding. Now they were asking permission to witness one. I let the silence do its work. Then I said, "You may attend, as guests." Nothing more. No planning input, no speeches, no family spotlight, no pretending. At the vow renewal, my mother cried during the vows. My father avoided my eyes until dinner. Vanessa did not come. I heard later she was furious, not because she had been excluded, because for once, the attention had settled somewhere she could not reach in and rearrange. That night, under string lights and soft summer air, I looked around at the people who had shown up for us. Friends, colleagues, neighbors, Daniel's aunt crying into a linen napkin, my old manager laughing near the bar. A life, a real one, built without permission, from the people who once thought I should settle for less. And that was the moment the story truly changed for me. Not when they asked for money, not when I said no, not even when they begged for the invitation. It changed when I realized revenge is often misunderstood. The best revenge is not making them feel your pain. It is removing their ability to define your worth. My parents spent years investing in appearances, in hierarchy, in the daughter who made them feel important. I invested in peace, in huil, in a marriage that could survive ordinary days, in a home where nobody had to audition for love. And in the end, they did come to my celebration. But they came the only way people like them ever truly arrive. Not as authors, as witnesses. If you've ever been treated like the child who was expected to settle for less, write karma in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. I want to know how far this story traveled tonight. This is Revenge Story Vault. And remember, boundaries are not cruelty. They are the price of self-respect. Meanwhile, Daniel and I quietly built our own wedding with what we had. At first, I told myself I didn't care. That small was fine. That intimate was romantic. And parts of that were true. But healing always begins when you stop confusing adaptation with preference. There were nights I cried over things that sounded embarrassingly small when spoken out loud. A venue I loved but couldn't afford. A dress I tried on twice and never bought. The fact that my mother never once asked what flowers I wanted. The fact that everyone knew Vanessa's caterer but no one knew my wedding date unless I reminded them. Pain is not always about grand losses. Sometimes it gathers around repetition. Around being an afterthought so often that your nervous system begins expecting disappointment before joy. Daniel never mocked those tears. He never said, "It's just one day," or, "At least we have each other." Though both of those things were technically true, he understood something my family never did. Symbolic neglect is still neglect. And weddings are not just logistics. They are a public answer to a private question. Who do people believe deserves to be celebrated? We got married in a botanical garden, 2 towns over on a clear October afternoon. 32 guests, white flowers, string lights, a pianist with silver hair and soft hands, mismatched vintage chairs the venue owner apologized for, that I ended up loving because they made the whole thing feel human instead of staged. My dress was simple. My shoes started hurting by the second hour. The cake leaned slightly to the left. It was perfect, not because it looked expensive, because every single thing present had been chosen with tenderness. No one was being ranked. No one was being rewarded. No one was being publicly crowned. My parents arrived late. My mother complained about the parking. My father asked whether there would be an open bar. Vanessa showed up in a dress so pale it could almost have passed for white if the light hit it wrong. She hugged me and whispered, "Cute, very you." For the first time in my life, I heard exactly what that meant. Small, contained, safe to overlook. And for the first time in my life, I did not try to correct her. I just smiled and said, "Exactly. If you've ever been the child who got called easy, only because everyone expected you to absorb more pain without complaint, type easy child in the comments. I want to know I'm not telling this story into empty air. The first year of marriage was not magical. It was better. And for people who grew up in emotional inequality, better can feel almost luxurious. Daniel and I learned each other in the ordinary way: utility bills, grocery lists, bad colds, shared calendars, laundry on chairs, burnt garlic, exhausted apologies at midnight, quiet Sunday coffee, and the small repeating proof that peace is not boring when you've spent your whole life surviving drama. He built a logistics consultancy out of our spare bedroom. I moved from project coordinator to operations lead, then into strategy after a merger hit my company like a storm, and I was one of the few people who could still think clearly while departments were reorganizing themselves in panic. The promotions did not come dramatically. They came because I was the kind of person who kept showing up after being underestimated. That is one of the hidden skills neglected daughters develop. We learn how to function without applause, which means when life finally gives us room, we can build very quietly and very far. Daniel and I bought a small house on the edge of town, with cracked front steps and outdated cabinets and a backyard big enough for possibility. The first night there, we ate takeout on the floor because the dining table hadn't arrived yet. There were boxes everywhere, and one overhead light flickering softly, like it wasn't sure it wanted to commit. I remember looking around at the mess and feeling a kind of gratitude so deep it scared me, because no one had gifted this to us, no one had orchestrated it, no one could threaten to withdraw love from it. It was ours. Slowly, almost invisibly, our life changed shape. He gained clients. I gained authority. We learned budgets, equity, maintenance schedules, tax headaches, emergency funds, how to say no, how to say later, how to recognize lifestyle inflation dressed up as reward. We bought a rental property, then another. Not mansions, not flashy investments, just steady, unglamorous decisions that stacked over time. Meanwhile, Vanessa's dream wedding began producing exactly the kind of marriage it had always been built to sustain. Beautiful on the outside, expensive, fragile. By the second year, there were stories about arguments. By the third year, there were awkward silences at family gatherings and unexplained card declines at restaurants. By the fourth year, there were rumors about debt. By the fifth, there was a separation so bitter even my mother stopped calling it a phase. The family vocabulary shifted. That is another thing people never say openly. When your role changes, everyone around you suddenly starts revising history. My father started calling more often. My mother asked more questions. Vanessa, who used to treat me like background furniture with a pulse, began sending texts full of exclamation points and fake warmth. "Hey stranger, we should do lunch soon. Mom says you're doing amazing. Proud of you. You always were the strong one." Be careful when people begin admiring the strength they once depended on you to need. Sometimes they're not honoring your growth. They're simply repositioning themselves near it. Around that time, my parents began dropping little comments that sounded harmless if you didn't know our history. "You've really done well for yourself. We always knew you'd land on your feet. You never needed as much help." That last one came from my father, while he was cutting into a roast chicken one Sunday at dinner, like he was commenting on the weather. And I remember looking at his hands steady, practiced, carving meat for a family that had never once carved fairness with the same precision and thinking, "No, I needed help. You just liked needing me less." That was one of the first internal shifts I can point to now. Healing is not always forgiveness. Sometimes healing is simply naming what happened in the language it deserves. My mother's version of events was always softer than reality. She was especially talented at describing structural cruelty as unfortunate circumstance. If she favored Vanessa, it was because Vanessa was more expressive. If I got less, it was because I was so capable. If she forgot something meaningful to me, it was because life had been so busy. If something hurt me deeply, it became a misunderstanding. A misunderstanding is when someone mishears the restaurant reservation. A misunderstanding is not telling one daughter she deserves a funded dream wedding and telling the other daughter to elope. Still, for years I let her language sit between us because confronting it felt exhausting. Then came the phone call. It was a Thursday in March. Rain tapped softly against our kitchen windows, and Daniel was upstairs on a client call while I stood barefoot on the tile, rinsing spinach in the sink, when my phone lit up with my mother's name. Her voice was careful, subdued. The way people sound when approaching a locked door they once expected would always be open. "Elara," she said, "your father and I were wondering if we could stop by this evening." There are tones adult children recognize before the words even arrive. The tone that means someone wants something. The tone that means the past is about to be walked around, not through. The tone that suggests your usefulness has come back into season. "Sure," I said, "come by." They arrived at 6:30. My mother wore navy and pearls. My father carried a bottle of wine, like peace could be purchased retail. Rainwater darkened the shoulders of his coat. Daniel made coffee, set out mugs, and then quietly disappeared upstairs, which was one of the deepest forms of loyalty I have ever known, letting me have my own confrontation without abandoning the room emotionally. We sat at our kitchen table. My table, solid oak, bought with my money, in a house they had never helped us purchase. In a kitchen warm with roasted garlic, coffee, and the sound of rain against the glass. My mother folded and unfolded her napkin. My father stared too hard at the fruit bowl. Finally, she said it. Vanessa is engaged again. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because I already knew this conversation wasn't about love. That's fast, I said. She deserves a fresh start, my mother replied. Deserves. That word, always hovering around Vanessa like a crown no one else was allowed to wear. I nodded and waited. My father cleared his throat. Well, things are a little tight right now. Of course they were. The divorce had been expensive. My parents had helped with legal fees, short-term rent, at least one maxed-out credit card, and if family whispers were to be believed, a car payment. Vanessa had somehow failed to mention until it became urgent. My mother leaned forward. We were hoping, she said, that maybe this time, since you and Daniel are doing so well, you could help. I let the silence stretch. With what? My father answered this time, as though saying it quickly might make it smaller. With the wedding. Not groceries. Not medical bills. Not rent after an eviction. Not some emergency that would test basic compassion. A wedding. Her second wedding. My mother named the amount. It was more than Daniel and I had spent on our entire wedding. I repeated the number back to her, because sometimes the mouth needs a second chance to verify what the ears refuse. She nodded. Then I smiled. Not cruelly, not dramatically, just with the clarity of someone who finally sees the shape of the trap. No, I said. My father reacted first. His face changed like weather. Shock, then disbelief, then offense. How can you be so cold? Cold. It is almost impressive how quickly some people can turn your boundaries into your crime. My mother's eyes filled, but not with remorse. With wounded entitlement. We're family, she whispered. And I said the sentence I wish I had learned at 20 instead of 33. Family is not a lifetime subscription to my sacrifice. Neither of them spoke. So I kept going. Not loudly, but clearly. The kind of clear that doesn't need volume because truth carries its own weight. You paid for Vanessa's dream wedding. You told me to elope. You watched me build a life without your support. And now that I have something stable, you've come back asking to collect from it. That isn't love. That's access. And access is something I control now. My mother cried. My father stood and paced like motion could create moral authority. He said I was being vindictive. He said I was holding on to bitterness. He said it was unhealthy to keep score. That one almost made me smile, because people who benefit from unequal treatment always seem to discover the beauty of not keeping score only after the bill arrives. You're embarrassing us, he said finally. There it was. Not you're hurting us. Not you're abandoning your sister. Embarrassing. Because somewhere in their heads, they had already told themselves a story in which I stepped in gracefully, wrote a check, smoothed things over, and made the family look functional again. I was refusing the role. And worse, I was refusing it calmly. Calm refusal is unbearable to people who need you reactive so they can paint themselves reasonable. After they left, Daniel came downstairs and found me still sitting at the kitchen table in the dark. The rain had stopped. Streetlight pooled softly through the windows. The coffee had gone cold. He sat across from me and said, "How bad?" I laughed once without humor. Bad enough that I finally feel better. He knew exactly what I meant, because there are confrontations that wound you. And then there are confrontations that end something poisonous. This one ended my illusion. Before I tell you what happened next, tell me this in the comments. What would you have done? A paid to keep peace. B said no, politely. C said no, and told them exactly why. I'm curious how other people see it. The call campaign started 3 days later. First, my mother called to check in. Then my father texted. Then an aunt I hadn't heard from in 6 months suddenly messaged. Heard there's some tension. Hope you're not letting money come between family. That sentence should be carved somewhere as a warning, because money rarely comes between family. What comes between family is the belief that one person's resources automatically belong to everyone else. The most revealing part was not that they asked. It was how quickly they assembled supporting characters once I said no. My cousin Mara called and tried diplomacy first. You know your parents are under stress. They weren't too stressed to fund the first wedding, I said. Silence. Then she tried the softer trap. You've always been the bigger person. That phrase used to work on me. It doesn't anymore. Being the bigger person often just means being the easier person to exploit. Another relative messaged me about grace. Another about forgiveness. No one messaged Vanessa to ask why her second wedding required financing she clearly couldn't support. No one asked my parents why fairness had never once moved in my direction. That is how systems preserve themselves. They don't just pressure the person asking for too much. They pressure the person finally asking for balance. I stopped explaining. That was a major shift too. For most of my life, I thought clarity required persuasion. That if I just found the right wording, the right tone, the right blend of firmness and warmth, people would finally understand. But understanding is not the issue with people who profit from misunderstanding you. So I stopped writing paragraphs. I sent one sentence. I'm not discussing this again. And for the first time in my life, I didn't apologize for the period at the end. Months passed. There was silence from my parents, then awkward holiday logistics, then a family barbecue where my father spoke to Daniel about mortgage rates for 12 minutes before acknowledging me, as if we were all participating in some emotionally advanced hostage exchange. Vanessa never confronted me directly. That was too risky. Instead, she posted things online. Quotes about betrayal, filtered photos with captions about learning who your real support system is. One especially dramatic line about people who pretend to be kind while secretly punishing you. I muted her. Peace is often less philosophical than people imagine. Sometimes peace is just one button and no more updates. Around that time, Daniel and I started talking seriously about trying for a baby. Not in the dreamy, abstract way we had before. Seriously. Calendar seriously. Doctor appointment seriously. Future school district seriously. 5 years had passed since our wedding. 5 full years of ordinary loyalty, practical joy, repaired appliances, tax returns, sore throats, small victories, arguments resolved before sleep, and a kind of love I had once been told was less glamorous simply because it was less performative. Daniel suggested we mark the anniversary with a trip. I suggested a dinner. Then one evening, while we were sitting on the back porch in late summer heat, with citronella in the air, and the smell of cut grass drifting in from the neighbor's yard, he said, "What if we did something a little bigger?" I looked at him. "Like what?" "A vow renewal," he said. "Not because we need one, because we deserve a day that reflects what we built." That sentence hit me in a place so old and quiet I had to sit with it. Deserve. Not perform. Not prove. Not shrink for. Deserve. We planned it carefully. A historic inn outside Asheville. 40 guests. A garden dinner under string lights. Leaf strings. Cream envelopes. Simple elegance. No spectacle. It was not revenge. That matters. I didn't create it to punish anyone. I created it because somewhere along the line, I had stopped confusing humility with erasure. And because healing sometimes looks like allowing yourself the celebration you were taught not to expect. I sent invitations in early spring. I sent one to my parents too. Not because guilt made me, and not because I wanted reconciliation theater. I sent it because I wanted to choose from power, not from injury. My mother called the day hers arrived. Her voice was thinner than I remembered. "Elara," she said, "we didn't think we'd be invited." I looked at the open envelope still lying on my counter and said, "I almost didn't." Silence. Then she asked the question. Not can we celebrate you, not how can we make things right, not what do you need from us. Can your father and I still come? 5 years earlier, they had decided I did not deserve a real wedding. Now they were asking permission to witness one. I let the silence breathe. Then I said, "You may attend. As guests. Nothing more." She understood exactly what I meant. No planning authority. No speeches. No maternal theatrics. No revisionist storytelling about how much she had always wanted this for me. Just guests. She cried quietly. I did not rescue her from that feeling. That is another misunderstood part of boundaries. You are not cruel for allowing other people to experience the consequences of reality without rushing in to soften every edge. As the date approached, something interesting happened. Family members started calling with a different tone entirely. Now there was curiosity. Polite curiosity, but curiosity all the same. Where was the event? How formal was it? How many guests? Was there a hotel block? Would Vanessa be there? There is nothing people like my parents understand faster than status. For years, my small wedding had been treated like confirmation that I naturally wanted less. But a carefully planned vow renewal at a historic inn reframed the narrative in a way they could not fully dismiss. It was not small because she's practical. It was elegant because she can. That distinction mattered to them far more than it should have. Vanessa RSVP de no. Officially, she had a scheduling conflict. Unofficially, according to my aunt, she was furious. Not because she'd been excluded, because attention was settling somewhere she could not reach in and rearrange. The week of the event, my mother called again and asked if she could help with anything. I almost admired the timing. 5 years too late and still presented as generosity. No, I said. Everything's handled. Maybe I could come early, she offered. Just in case you need support. Support. A beautiful word, misused by people who think proximity to your milestone retroactively qualifies as care. We're good, I said, and for once, I meant it in every direction. The inn sat just outside Asheville, tucked among old trees and stone pathways, with a lawn that sloped gently toward a garden lit in strands of warm white bulbs. On the afternoon of the vow renewal, the air was soft and humid, carrying the scent of roses, cut greenery, linen warmed by sun, and a trace of wood smoke from somewhere beyond the property. I got dressed in a quiet upstairs room with tall windows and faded blue wallpaper. No bridal frenzy, no house, no 6 people talking over each other. Just my closest friend, a steaming cup of tea gone mostly untouched, and a dress the color of cream that moved when I breathed instead of against me. When I looked in the mirror, I did not look like the woman from my first wedding. Not because of age, because of posture. I was no longer bracing for disappointment. That changes a face. My parents arrived 20 minutes before the ceremony. I saw them from the upstairs window crossing the lawn, my father in a dark suit, my mother in pale mauve, both moving with that particular stiffness people carry when they know they're entering a story that no longer centers them. I didn't go down to greet them. That would have been my old role. I let guests greet guests. The ceremony was simple. No performance. No over-explaining. No speeches about fate or dramatic declarations designed for an audience. Daniel stood beneath the arbor, shoulders relaxed, looking exactly the way safe love feels. Steady, present, unafraid of depth that doesn't need spectacle. When I reached him, he smiled in that quiet way he does when emotion is so real, he doesn't trust himself to say too much. We renewed the vows we had lived, not just spoken. I promised to protect peace, not just passion. He promised to keep making a life where softness never had to compete with chaos to be seen. At one point during the ceremony, I glanced toward the chairs. My mother was crying. My father was not looking at me. He was looking at Daniel. And I knew that look. It was the look men like him get when they realize another man built dignity around the daughter they underestimated. Not with speeches, not with money borrowed for display, not with grand rescue, with daily respect. That kind of realization ages people all at once. Dinner was held under strings of light as evening settled blue around the garden. There were long tables, linen runners, candles in glass hurricanes, soft music, low conversation, silverware on china, and that gentle, impossible feeling that sometimes arrives when a life you fought hard for finally becomes visible from the outside. My old manager laughed near the bar. Daniel's aunt cried into a napkin. Our neighbor from the first house toasted us with too much wine and perfect sincerity. Friends moved from table to table, trading stories that belonged to a life built in public truth, not family fiction. My parents sat halfway down the right table. Guests. Exactly as promised. At one point, my mother approached me softly and said, "It's beautiful." I looked at her for a moment and said, "Thank you." Not, "You're okay." Not, "I'm glad you came." Not, "This means so much." Just the truth that fit. "Thank you." Later, my father tried something different. He caught me near the edge of the lawn while guests were moving toward dessert. "You've done well," he said. "There are sentences that would have healed me at 22. Not at 33. I nodded. "Yes, I have." He waited, perhaps expecting an opening. Some bridge, some invitation to confession, apology, fatherhood. When none came, he said, "I suppose we didn't always see things clearly." That was as close to accountability as he knew how to get. And maybe years earlier, I would have taken that half sentence and finished the rest for him in my own heart. "Not anymore." I said, "No, you didn't." Then I smiled, not unkindly, but not helpfully either, and turned back toward the people who had actually shown up for my life. And that was the public reversal. Not a screaming confrontation. Not a dramatic speech in front of everyone. Not me humiliating anyone. Something better. They stood in the middle of a celebration they once thought I did not deserve, watching the full architecture of my life stand around me without their support holding any of it up. That is what they had really come to see. Not just an invitation. Evidence. Evidence that I had built joy without them. Evidence that their hierarchy had failed. Evidence that the daughter they once categorized as practical, smaller, easier to overlook, had become the one living inside the kind of respect they could neither purchase nor redirect. If this story is hitting you right now, type karma in the comments. Not because karma is magic, because sometimes the most honest form of karma is simply this. The person you minimized learns to live without your approval. After dinner, as twilight deepened and the strings overhead glowed warmer against the dark, we moved toward the lawn for coffee and dessert. There was a moment small, almost forgettable to anyone else when I stood with a plate in one hand and looked out at the whole scene. The arbor, the candles, the low hum of conversation, Daniel laughing with friends. My mother seated quietly, no longer directing anything. My father watching from a distance he had earned, and something inside me unlocked. Not anger, not triumph, understanding. Because for years, I thought the story would end when they apologized, or when they admitted I had been treated unfairly, or when they finally said the words I had needed all along. But that was never the real ending. The ending came when their recognition stopped being necessary for my peace. That's when power changes hands. Not when they understand you. When you no longer need them to. The weeks after the vow renewal were quiet. That's important too. Because life is not a movie, and the best revenge stories are often misunderstood by people expecting a dramatic collapse on the other side. There was no immediate grand apology. No miraculous family repair. My mother sent a thank you card. A thank you card. For being invited to the celebration they once believed I didn't need. I kept it in a drawer for months, not as a trophy, but as a reminder of how strange truth can look once it survives long enough to become undeniable. My father called twice that summer. The first time to ask how the drive home had been. The second time to tell me he was thinking of repainting the house and ask whether I knew a good contractor. Ordinary questions. And maybe to someone else that would sound insignificant. But to me, it told the whole story. People like my father rarely apologize directly. What they do instead is start behaving as if your competence has become a fact they can safely orbit. It isn't redemption, but it is information. Vanessa, for her part, stayed away. Then one night in early fall, she texted me after nearly 6 weeks of silence. Heard the event was nice. Mom cried for 2 days. I stared at the message for a long time. Then another came. Must feel good getting your moment. There it was. The worldview at the core of everything. Moments. As if what I had was not a life. As if joy was a stage slot. As if celebration was a limited household resource one sister stole from the other. For Vanessa, everything had always been comparative. Visibility-based. Measured by who got more. That is the hidden misery of being the favorite child, I think. If love is always inflated around you, you start mistaking attention for oxygen. Then the second someone else is seen clearly, it feels like suffocation. I typed a response. Deleted it. Typed another. Deleted that too. Finally, I sent one sentence. It wasn't a moment. It was a life you never bothered to notice. She never replied. Human touch. And this is the part I want to say directly. Outside the story for a second. A lot of people assume the neglected child secretly wants to become the favorite. I never did. I didn't want my sister's pedestal. I wanted a family where no child had to stand on one to be visible. That distinction matters. Because healing is not becoming what harmed you. Healing is refusing the system altogether. The winter after the vow renewal, Daniel and I found out I was pregnant. Very early. Too early to tell most people. I sat on the bathroom floor holding that test and shaking hands, while morning light crept through the blinds in thin, pale bars. There are moments in life when the past and future stand in the same room together. That was one of them, because the first thought I had was joy, and the second was fear. Not fear of motherhood, fear of inheritance. Not money, not property, patterns. I thought about all the ways neglect repeats itself quietly, through tone, through assumptions, through the child who gets described as strong, easy, mature, resilient, while another gets softness, attention, and rescue. I made a promise right there on the tile before I ever said the words out loud to anyone else. No child of mine would ever have to earn visibility by needing less. That promise, more than anything, changed the way I looked at my own parents after that. I felt less anger, not because what they did became smaller, because I finally understood how preventable it had been. Love requires attention. Fairness requires thought. And if two adults fail at that consistently for decades, it is not confusion. It is choice. When we eventually told my parents about the pregnancy, my mother cried again. She cries often now. Age has made her softer in expression, though not always clearer in language. My father hugged Daniel first, then me. A familiar order. I noticed. I always notice now. That's another thing people misunderstand. Boundaries do not erase history. They just stop history from driving the car. My mother started saying she wanted to help with the baby. I let her buy a blanket. Not because she had earned intimacy, because I had learned the difference between controlled access and open doors. She could participate in what I allowed, not what she assumed. That sentence right there may be the entire moral of my story. People who once treated you as permanently available will often interpret your first healthy limit as punishment. It isn't. It's architecture. And architecture matters most after a lifetime of living in emotional houses that never protected you. I saw my parents differently after that. Not as villains in every scene, and not as victims of their own limitations either. Just people. People who had built a family around habit, image, favoritism, and emotional shortcuts. People who probably loved me in the abstract, and failed me in the practical. That happens more often than anyone wants to admit. Love, if it never changes behavior, starts becoming a decorative word. And I had finally learned not to decorate reality anymore. The baby arrived healthy in late summer after 19 hours of labor. 3 failed attempts at breathing through contractions like the birthing class suggested, 1 bruised hand from gripping the hospital rail, and 1 moment in the middle of the night where I looked at Daniel and said, "You did this to me." And he laughed so hard he nearly cried. We named our daughter June. When my mother first held her, she looked older than I'd ever seen her. Not fragile, just aware. Aware that history was standing there in a hospital room asking what kind of grandmother she intended to be. Aware perhaps that daughters eventually become mothers, and in doing so, acquire a perspective that makes old family lies harder to maintain. I watched her hold June and something inside me settled again. Because I no longer wanted retroactive justice. I wanted a different lineage. And that is where this story truly ends. Not with my parents begging for an invitation, though they did. Not with my sister being furious, though she was. Not even with the public reversal of them sitting quietly at a celebration they once believed I didn't deserve. It ends here, in a nursery painted soft white, in the smell of baby lotion and warm cotton, in the low whir of the sound machine at 2 a.m, in a tiny hand curled around one of my fingers, in the knowledge that love, real love, is not proven by who gets the bigger event. It is proven by who never has to ask whether they matter. That is the lesson my parents taught me by failing to teach it well. And maybe that's the strangest kind of inheritance. They gave me the blueprint by getting it wrong. So yes, 5 years after they told me to elope, they begged for an invitation to mine. And yes, I let them come, but not because they had reclaimed authority in my life, because they hadn't. They came the only way people like that ever truly arrive in the end. Not as authors, as witnesses. Witnesses to a life built without their investment. Witnesses to a marriage that outlasted spectacle. Witnesses to the cost of favoritism. Witnesses to the daughter they once thought would quietly accept less. If you've ever had to build your own worth in a family that kept pricing you below what you deserved, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? And what line in this story hit you the hardest? This is Revenge Story Vault. And remember, boundaries are not cruelty. They are the price of self-respect.